Thank you, everybody. Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and this year by the United States Philatelic Classic Society. This session's speaker, James Milgram, collects both United States covers and letter papers of the 18th and 19th century. He is a prolific philatelic author and co-author of over 500 articles in such journals as the American Philatelist, Stamps Magazine, the SPA Journal, the Postal History Journal, the Confederate Philatelist, the Chronicle of U.S. Philatelic Classic Issues, the Western Express, and the American Stamp Dealer and Collector. He is also the author of 8 books, and has written extensively on topics such as Confederate postal history, U.S. postal history, transcontinental mail, illustrated envelopes and letter sheets, Indian Territory postal markings, express mail, and registered mail. As a member of the American Philatelic Society since September of 1958, he has been awarded many honors for his writing, most notably the Elliott Perry Cup in 1987, the Stanley B. Ashbrook Cup in 1999, the Susan M. McDonald Award in 2001, and more recently in 2013, he was awarded the U.S.Stamp Society-Barbara R. Mueller Award. It is with great honor the 2020 Postal History Symposium presents Dr. James Milgram and his presentation titled Early Railroads Carry the Mail. Dr. Milgram?
Thank you very much. The plan of this talk is on this slide here. I'm going to discuss the beginning of railroads, then I'll get into philately, showing earlier usages, and then we'll progress by date through the 1847 overlapping with stamp lists, then through 1850s. We're going to talk about multiple ways that letters were carried. A single letter could be carried on both steamboats and railroads. I'm going to discuss something about station markings, and then we're going to go to corner guards, Campbell. These are in the 1850s and 1860s, and then we'll end up with the later usages. And then the last 2 topics are going to be official business of railroads, and finally the Transcontinental Railroad. The books that I would like to recommend to you is the first book is by Remley. This was published serially in the American Philatelist. It is a hardcover book now. As you see, the title, it says 1837, so it goes from the earliest stamp list, and it ends with the 1857 stamps. It doesn't go to the 1860s. This is a very good book, and I recommend it for those earlier markings. The catalog, this is the catalog, and if you collect railroads, this is a must book to have. It's by Charles Towle. The only thing I take issue is he divides it into 2 groups here, the route agent and station agent markings, which we'll discuss later. The other book, which I also highly recommend, is published by my club, the Collectors Club of Chicago. I was actually one of the editors on this book. This is a book that lists the maps and the technical aspects of the railroads. In other words, it lists every station that ever carried mail. And so if you have a cover, you can look it up as a station, and then it'll take you to whatever state the railroad went through, and you can trace your individual cover. So it's very good. It's the only thing that really is good to trace covers. And it's a great big fat book, but I highly recommend it. Early railroad companies. The early railroad was the earliest one in the United States was the John Bull, and that was run by Stevens, who was also an early steamboat man. You may know I wrote a book on steamboats. It's a catalog for steamboat covers, so I'm interested in steamboats too. The railroad's first one that actually was a railroad was in 1830. The Mohawk and Hudson we'll discuss subsequently, because I'm going to show you a couple of covers that were on that railroad. The Charleston Railroad we'll discuss because it had the earliest known cover. The earliest known railroad known to carry mails did it for a stagecoach operator. They didn't have a contract. I'm going to read you a very short piece from a letter. This is a stampless cover. You can see that there. And it's dated July 5th, 1835. So it's pretty early. And it says there started 36 railroad cars from the depot in Charles Street. That's downtown Baltimore. I live there. Each car containing 112 passengers, all connected to the locomotive engine, with 2 bands of the 1st and 2nd Rifles escorting them to Ellicott Mills, which is 15 miles on the Frederick Railroad, so it's going west. And he says another train started for Washington on the new line, and I had the pleasure of going in the first car last Wednesday that ever run. So he was on the first car in the first railroad ever going to Washington. That's very interesting. This is a circular that I have, and it discusses the expediency of constructing a railroad from Boston. This circular is dated 1827. So railroads were thought of in the 1820s in the United States. This is the cover from that circular. It's folded up, and you see it has a Boston 6, which is under 30 miles, and it's Acton, Massachusetts. So it's very close to Boston. But the interesting thing is you can see this railway hand stamp. Obviously there was no railroad to carry this, so this is about railroads. It's very unusual for a circular to have a hand stamp like this. I don't know the reason for it. I just am guessing that maybe they were just advertising themselves. Now, the General's report in 1833 is very interesting, and I'll just read little parts of it. The celerity of the mail should always be equal to the most rapid transition of the traveler, and that which shortens the time of communication and facilitates the intercourse between distant places, like bringing them together. And he talks about why it's good. And these considerations always have been on my mind, the full weight of my mind, in making improvements in mail operations. The multiplication of railroads in different parts of the country promises within a few years to give great rapidity to the movements of travelers, and it is worthy of inquiry whether measures may not be taken to secure the transportation of the mail upon them. So this is the very first discussion by post office for mail on the post on railroads. And all of these next aspects of this talks about the different railroads. And he says in the last paragraph, this is Postmaster General Berry, when this shall be done, the whole distance between this city and New York on a continuous railroad will not exceed 240 miles. And that was the idea of doing this. Now, in 1835, from Tal's book, these railroads existed. And the Camden, North Amboy is a part of the New York going south to Baltimore. The Baltimore-Washington Railroad, I just read you a little piece of that first trip on that. Note the Petersburg Railroad next to the bottom there. The railroad he just mentioned also was the Baltimore to Frederick, Maryland Railroad. Now, I've written a book on the express mails of 1836, and this is the map that's from that book. And if you will look in the upper right corner, you see New York. And below that, you see a railroad kind of cross-hatching of the markings. And so railroads did carry the express mail from New York and eventually down to Washington. There was only one other area of the express mail that was carried in railroad, and that was south of Petersburg. The route that you see here on the map is New York at the top, and all the way at the bottom left is New Orleans, and that's called the Great Mail, and that was the reason for the express mail. The routes that you see on the left side, the ones that go west from Cincinnati and that area, were later routes. The railroads were the reason for the discontinuance of the express mail, which was a triple rate. This is an example of a express mail cover, and my point is that this cover was carried by railroad, and it is marked express mail here. It has a 56 1/4 rate, which is a triple 18 3/4 rate here, and The one is a single marking, but it goes to Richmond. Now, it was carried by the express rider to the lowest route on the map. So it would have gone, if we go back to the other map here, Richmond is on the express, you see there, just north of where the cross-hatching is for Petersburg. So this cover went all the way in express mail. So it was carried on railroad partly, and then partly on the express rider. That was the first Pony Express in the United States. This is a poster from Phillips, New York in 1836, and it's proselytizing people to buy stock for the Auburn and Rochester Railroad. And so this shows you the beginning of the construction of railroads and how there were individual companies that built railroads to carry passengers and freight, basically. The mails came along as a secondary thing. The earliest known cover it was owned, I've been told, by Bernard Bialis, a friend of mine, and he says that he sold it, so I can't get it. July 1835 is the date of it, and it was used on that South Carolina Railroad that we talked about. Feldman's book shows that that contract is 2271, and that the contract was awarded in January of 1834. So a cover from 1835 would have been an actual railroad. However, this was not carried by a railroad route agent, but it was carried by the railroad and then marked as a way letter at Hamburg, South Carolina, and has a postmark of South Carolina. Most covers that are carried by railroad associated with the route agents don't have any postmarks on them other than the route agent marking. We'll get later on about what the route agent is. This is an example of another cover that was carried in a similar fashion. This is from the ironworks that are on the New Clay Creek in Wooddale, Delaware. And so it's just north of Wilmington. This is a company that you see in the lower left, railroad with one small cogwheel. And so this is a way letter, and it was charged 6 cents plus 1 cent for way, but it came on the railroad. Railroad marking with ways are very, very rare. There are only a handful of those known. The very first route agent usage was in 1837 when this railroad, there actually are two railroads here. There's a short railroad from Albany to Schenectady. Albany is east, Utica is west. So Albany to Schenectady, which is west of Albany, 16 miles. And then there was an 80-mile route between Schenectady going west to Utica, going both ways, of course. They hooked up together so that you could send a letter from Utica to Albany. And this is where the route agent was. Powell, I got this from Powell's book, and he mentions that it was Kendall's nephew, but that's the way it goes. Railroad in a straight line. You see this cover here? This is the earliest known route agent postmark on a railroad cover. Two of these are known, and this is the earlier one from November 2nd, 1837. And it reads in Old English script, rail and then road. Because it's a 12-cent rate to Albany, going from west to east, it had to travel on both railroads, not just the Albany and Schenectady Railroad, but also the Utica and Schenectady Railroad. This is the earliest known steamboat route agent cover, and this is also 1837, September 6th, 1837, and it was on the Louisville-Cincinnati route. This is a letter that began in Louisville and goes east to Madison, Indiana, and it's marked mail boat. That's a route agent hand stamp marking in manuscript, and then he rated it 10 cents for the route distance from Louisville to Madison in 1837. This is the earliest known named route agent postmark. It's Utica and Schenectady Railroad that we just talked about. And this letter began in Utica from the letter, which is enclosed here, and it's paying a 10-cent rate. And it goes to Fonda. Fonda is a town that actually is a town on the railroad. This is related to the family of actors, this Fonda, and their ancestor had been scalped by Indians, and that's why they named the town after him. Remley has markings of another group of these early railroad markings that are from mostly New York, from Massachusetts, and you can see many of the early markings, and they're manuscript markings too, at least 3 or 4 types, that don't show the name of the railroad in them. They just say railroad. But you can calculate what train it was on and the company from the destination and the origin of the cover. This is a different marking, the railroad car. It's one of those hand stamps, and it shows you a manuscript of Springfield, which is actually probably on the cover. It's not rated, but it would have been very low from Springfield to West Brookfield in Massachusetts. The interesting extra marking on this is in the center, you see CHD. That's a postal marking applied at the West Brookfield post office that the box holder, Charles Merriam, had this 6 cents charged to his box account. I'll show you the reverse usage on a cover very shortly, charging it at the time of mailing. This is the Baltimore, Maryland Railroad straight line with a year date on it, and that's a route agent marking used on the way from between Baltimore and going into Philadelphia here. You see 2 markings of the Philadelphia post office, although the post office route agent paid there, and he wrote 18¾ so he rated the cover. That's the rate to get to New York City. Once it got to New York City, it was sent by packet over to France. So route agents are post office employees that are stationed on different trains. Now, the trains didn't control these. They were on the trains, but they were controlled by the post office, and they were paid by the post office. What was their job? Well, their job was handling the mail sacks from one town to the next on the train. And also, they had a postmaster marking device, either manuscript or a hand stamp, and they marked the mail that was received as way letters, loose mail that there was uncanceled at the time of handing it to the route agent. They did not sort the mail. That was later on. We'll get to that in a second. After 1867, and I don't know the reason for this, there's also a group of people called the mail route messengers. I'll show you one postmark, but most of the postmarks that you will ever see are route agent postmarks, not mail route messenger markings. This is an early stampless railroad cover, and you can see it says Washington Railroad very clearly. The letter is from Philadelphia, from Baltimore, excuse me, and it's rated 5 cents, which is after 1845. The rates were 5 and 10, the lower rates that Gordon Eubanks talked about yesterday. And this cover, in addition to being a railroad route agent cover, also was marked at Philadelphia as having valuable contents. So it's an early marking of the R marking. It's within 2 months of the beginning of R markings, which began November 1st, 1845. The U.S. Express mail was markings, and there's a number of types of those. This is the one that ran from Boston to Albany, and this cover is going west to Albany, and it shows U.S. Express mail, which is a marking that the railroad applied. The route agents used this to counter the local expresses. It was an advertising thing. It's discussed in great detail in paragraphs by Elliott Perry. This particular cover was given to me by Nord Sampson, and he gave it to me because it's dated July 1st, 1845. So it's the first day of the 5 cent rate with a express mail cover. This is another registered cover. This one that shows you the U.S. Express mail from Boston. And so this one is going from Boston to New York And then south into Philadelphia, at Philadelphia, it again has the R marking on it. So it's again and this is within 3 weeks of the beginning of registration. So these are two very early registered R covers. In addition, this cover says charge box 428 and it's marked paid. So the postage on this was marked to a box number. The letter itself is dateline from Baltimore. So I think that this cover probably was handled as loose mail into the express mail rather than receiving a Boston postmark. But the postmaster did know to charge the postage to that box count. Perhaps there was a arrangement between the route agent and the postmaster about that. This is an example of a rare early straight line postmark from the Providence and Worcester Railroad. There was only one of these known before this cover came up. There are a few types, but it's an example of straight line markings on railroad. This is an interesting cover. It has the Baltimore Railroad straight line marking. In addition to that, the stamp was tied, 1847 stamp, with a 5 in a circle, and I show that marking from another cover over in the lower left corner, overlapping the two covers. But this cover was also carried by a hotel, so a hotel forwarder took it and got it to the railroad, where it went then north on the Baltimore Railroad. Very interesting cover, and it's an interesting story about it, that my father and I went to a deserted house in Brooklyn, New York, and I went into one of the old closets. We were looking around there, and I found this on the floor. There were about 4 letters from California, too, and the Leland family were great owners of hotels in California. One wonders what that correspondence could have been. This is another 1847 marking, and here we have a postmarking device used by the route agent on the stamp. Now, you could have a manuscript cancel, you could have a hand stamp on the stamp, or you could use that Eastern Railroad and tie it to the cover with the circular marking. Actually, that's what was done very frequently with stamps, as you'll see in later covers, that the postmarking device also canceled the stamp. But here we have this very nice multi-grid canceling device. Gordon was asked about this yesterday. These markings, the grids, were invented to cancel stamps. It's obvious because they don't exist before then. This is another 1847 usage for a much rarer railroad. There are only a couple examples of this railroad known, and this is the well-known cover, the one at the top. I wanted to discuss that there's an overlap here between stampless covers and stamped covers, and you can see that this is an overlap. He uses a paid hand stamp, although he uses a stamp, and he has a 5 rating mark, which is a stampless cover marking. He uses it also to cancel the stamp. So he's showing, yes, this is paid by that stamp. But that's very unusual, and in time we get to the lower cover, which is the same railroad, marked very rare in Remley. Remley has rarity factors in it and useful for that. And you can see the orange-brown stamp is canceled again with a grid, different grid, but each railroad route agent would have grids of their own. Here's an example of the 10-cent 1847 Baltimore Railroad with a manuscript cancel. And the contents of this letter is another hotel. And so this may be a similar kind of usage as I showed you with that straight line marking from the hotel. But I don't know that for sure. It could have been just a letter sheet that was used in that envelope. These are 4 covers from the Alexander Stephens correspondence. He was vice president of the Confederacy. And the interesting thing here is that they are in 4 different colors: green from the bottom, red, blue, and black. This is the only multicolor selection of railroad covers that I've ever seen. This is an example of what is called an integral postmark, or integrated. I call them integral. and that has a rate or paid in the hand stamp. And so you only needed one hand stamp to mark both the rate and the name of the boat, or name of the ship, or name of the town. These were mostly used by towns. They commonly say 3 paid. They may have rate markings on them. They could be attached on the outside. And during the 1830s, there was a large group of these with all the different rates from 6 to 25 as attached hand stamps. And some of them would say paid, some would say free. Those are integral postmarks. This is a manuscript postmark showing you an example of it. This is the only known example of this railroad, Central Railroad of New Jersey. These are route agent postmarks, and these are typical route agent postmarks. I'm showing this cover from the more common Baltimore and Philadelphia Railroad because of the usage. It's a 1-cent stamp, and this is a unused, printed, unused circular. It's not filled out. It's blank, and it was sent to the widow, you see, of Pratt, or any widow of the Revolution. So he's looking for business. He's an agent. This is a very interesting usage. The Pacific Railroad. Pacific Railroad was a railroad that was intended to run from St. Louis all the way west to the coast. It never got out of Missouri. And it was built, but not for a very long distance. It's very rare marking, according to Rumley. Very rare means less than 5 known. And the interesting thing about that railroad is this. This is an invitation to the earliest opening of the railroad. To the cities of Jefferson City, respectfully invite you to this city for the opening of the Pacific Railroad. And this railroad carried a train of cars, and the bridge collapsed at the Gastonade River Bridge. And this is the first great railroad disaster. There were a lot of people that were killed in this famous disaster. It's in 1855. Now we're getting into the next topic is the combined transportation. And this applies mostly to goods, freight. And so we have a picture here of a canal boat and a locomotive on this transportation company that ran all the way in different cities in the east, as you can see here. That canal boat, by the way, is pictured with windows, so therefore this is a passenger-carrying canal boat. Canal boats did not carry the mail for the most part. There's one canal line in Virginia that did carry mail, but that's about the exception. We also have steamboats that carried the mail, and this is a letter carried on the steamer Mayflower, and you see that it's owned by a railroad. So the idea here is the railroads would carry the letter to Buffalo, and then at Buffalo the letter would be put on a steamboat and would go all the way to Detroit or even to Chicago. And you can see this letter is written on Lake Erie. So this letter began on the boat. This same company owned this cover, produced this cover, the Western World, which is a steamboat corner card, and it's owned by the same Michigan Central Railroad. It's dated in the marking 1857. This is a corner card. It wasn't on the steamboat, but the steamboat owned the line. Another different line where there's a combination of steamboats and railroads is from New York to Boston. It was carried from New York City to Stonington by vessels, and then it was sent into Boston by the railroad. And this marking reads New York and Boston Steamboat and RRR, Railroad Route. Not at all rare. You can get these very nicely. But this one went from New York City, and it went through Boston, and then it went by other railroads up to Portland, Maine. Now we get into the topic of route agents or station agents, which has been an interesting aspect of mine. And I've actually written an article in the Chronicle on this. Okay, it's my belief that all of these markings, and I mean all, are route agent markings. There's no such a thing as a station agent postmark. The reason for that is very simple. Station agents weren't employees of the post office and couldn't handle mail. They should be termed route agent station markings. And I will just go through the Baltimore and Ohio, which is a very big railroad and carried a lot of mail. So we have two covers here from 1843 and 1851, and manuscript at first, and then a hand stamp that reads B&O Railroad. And all those markings are this is one of those way markings too. It was not charged an extra penny, however, but they're very, very uncommon way markings on railroads. All right, now we get into the 1860s, and the same railroad always, and I mean always, has a station a name in the B&O marking. So this is one from B&O Railroad, and it goes during the Civil War, just after the Civil War began, on a patriotic cover. And it's Mark Hood's Mill. This cover was addressed to Stabler, Postmaster Sandy Spring, and he's the guy that used the Quaker postmarks. So he's well known, and it is a free in that red marking here, but it's still a route agent postmark, not a station agent postmark. Here, the same train uses B&O Railroad, and here's from the Morovia station. So it's marked from that station. This one goes to an Army address in St. Denis, Maryland. So this is a typical of what Feldman has. He has these maps, and you go from the top map from the west, Wheeling, you go all the way towards Baltimore. Then we go on the lower map from 43 to 43, and then we go east to Baltimore, which is west of number 77. And you can see here a list of the stations. This is what he has on it. So you can look up your stations by doing this. Now, you can see that 69 is Hood's Mill. You can see that 65 is Moravia. 61 is Adamstown, very, very common marking. 47 is Sir John's Run, another one you see a lot of. And 43 is Pawpaw, which these are all seen on covers of the 1860s. Some of these are on patriotic covers too. The earliest markings that have the name of the station in them are different railroads. This is the second earliest railroad that I know of that uses station marking, and this is one of a couple of known covers from this railroad. The Mineral Point is the station name, and it's 1856. This is from Remley's book. It gives you an idea of what Remley's book shows you. This is a very typical picture in Remley's book, but he shows you drawings of 4 different stations, all on the Illinois Central Railroad. And to the left, it says June of 1855. I know of a cover from February of 1855, different station on that same railroad. So that would probably be the earliest known station marking. Now, there are covers that have station agent hand stamps on them, but they're not route agent markings. This man is the postmaster of Savannah, New York. His name is James Case, and he's writing a personal letter to his cousin Chloe. So you can see the hand stamp on the cover is also on the letter inside, and he marks it manuscript free Case. And this is essentially a postmaster free frank. Instead of putting the town marking, however, he uses his station marking. It has his name in it, and it says receiver on it. This hand stamp is known on a stamp, so he did cancel stamps with it, but he did that as postmaster. He didn't do that as a railroad, is part of his railroad job. I'm just showing you examples of corner cards made with pictures of railroads. And the top 2 pair show you the 2 types. To the left is one where the design is all printed and it's you see very detailed, and that is a flat printing. These are cameos. On the right, however, the Hope Express Company, all of the lettering is raised, and you can see the train itself, all of the detail of the train is raised. So these are embossed, as well as printed. And the machine that made these did both at the same time. It went out of fashion after the 1860s, but for a couple of years, these embossed markings were used. You can see in the lower two pair also combinations of railroads and other means of transportations, as I mentioned before. The one shows you a canal boat, and the other shows you a steam engine. Steam engines, of course, were responsible for locomotives as well as steamboats. And as Scott discussed yesterday, he thought that the steam engine was the most innovative aspect of carrying the mails. I would, while we're on that subject, I would like to re-emphasize what Scott Trumbull showed you. This book is very worthwhile. He's a professor at the University of Chicago. I know him personally. And he gave a talk on this subject at the Collectors Club of Chicago. And his basic point, the most important point about the mails, is that the mails was the mean for communication throughout the country. And they wanted to keep the postage and the mail so that it would distribute news. So the postage rate may be high, 25 cents for a letter, but newspapers and printed matter like that, it was nothing, it was a penny, because they distributed the news via the newspaper. And so the way you, if you were running for president in 1840, you had to distribute your message, and the way that was done was by the mails. And so communication was vital, and the railroads played a very important role in this by speeding up communication and news. These are two cameos from the West. This is the Lawrenceville and Upper Mississippi, and you again see it's embossed, as is the lower one. The lower is not a railroad company that carried mail. So this is purely a corner card of that railroad company. This is a propaganda cover for cheap postage, and it has a beautiful picture of a train on it. So this is an example, if you will, maybe the finest example of a cover of the railroad on an illustrated envelope. This also shows Steamboat, of course, because they're talking about ocean postage. This is a very interesting cover to me. It says General Grant on the engine, too. I don't know if you can read that. It says General Grant, too, as well as on the coal tender. And this is, I think, an advertisement by the company for Grant to be president. And it's in April '67, so it's a year before he was elected president. There is a very famous general marking the train. That was the train in the Great Railroad Chase. And I encourage you to read about that. It took place during the Civil War, where a bunch of Union spies tried to sabotage trains in the South and were chased by another train, another engine. Railroad illustrated corner cards like this are very, very uncommon. The steamboats did this. So you can find different steamboat illustrations on the letterheads and on the envelopes. They're not so rare, but on railroads, this kind of advertising this one's for the Memphis and Charleston Railroads, very unusual. It's probably made by this particular person who wrote the letter. He has his address up here, and he wrote this particular letter. And he was an agent for this. Route agent markings in the 1860s are dated circles, so almost exclusively. They didn't use, I think there's a couple of straight lines, but almost all are circles. And you see that the circle marking of the railroad route agent was used to cancel the stamp. It was repeated on the cover because you can't read it on the stamp, so he wanted to make sure you could read it. And the interesting aspect of this is the Civil War patriotic cover, and the date is April 16th. Well, April 16th is 4 days after April 12th, which is one date of the opening of the Civil War, Fort Sumter. And this happens to be the second earliest known railroad patriotic cover of any nature with any kind of hand stamp on it. So Union patriotic covers are only known from April 12th, 1861. I have a letter sheet dated April 12th, 1861, which is the earliest known Union piece of stationery. Confederates had stationery earlier because they printed stationery after the formation of the Confederacy. So Confederate stationery began earlier. It was used, of course, during the war, too. The Union troops were supported by railroads, and it was a very important part of running the war. The railroads carried all the freight, carried all the food, carried all the men, did everything. And there was a organization called the U.S. Military Railroads, a network of trains that had been taken into the hands of the Army to be used, and they carried everything, and they had no postmarks. They're not route agents. They're the railroads themselves. This is like a railroad company, if you will, but it's a U.S. Railroad. This marking at the top is a hand-stamped corner card. The same marking is on the back of the envelope that goes with that cover. The front is just a postmark from the town of Alexandria, Virginia. The bottom is a pair. The letter sheet and the cover go together, and it just shows you what you can find from the military railroads. This is all you can find from the military railroads. This is another 3 corner cards, 2 from Nashville at the top and one, and they have different, Washington at the bottom. They have different terminology on them. I think they're very interesting and certainly part of the railroads during the Civil War. The Confederates had railroads. Nearly every single railroad postmark used in the Confederacy have the name of stations in them. So they are route agent station markings. This one is from Estelle Springs, that's the station name, and the railroad is the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. This is a cover that was sent from a soldier. You see soldier's letter at the top here, and then we have a manuscript in the center, due 10. So this is soldier's letter. Most of these postmarks are found on stamps, however, usually the later issues. Railroad post offices is a term that began after 1864 for a postal facility on a train. It was a special car that was fitted up and attached to a train in which postal clerks, employees of the post office department, had postmarking devices, and they sorted the mail. So this is the beginning of sorting the mail on the train. And they basically sorted it from the pickup, and they also did sorting of the mail to drop off for waypoints. So it was a way of using the time on the railroad to get the letter to where it's supposed to go. They use different markings, and they're very similar to the route agent markings. There's no special marking by the postal clerk different from route agent markings. The markings could read railroad, RPO, railroad post office, and agent, which stands for route agent. Some of these also worked as clerks later in the 1870s. Here's an example of 1860 usage. You see the abbreviation of the railroad with 4 different names here, and this marking has an interesting mail line in the postmark. I also show this cover because of this fantastic eagle weather vane of copper. Wouldn't you just love to have that? I have to tell you a little story. When I was growing up, I lived in Brooklyn Heights, and the Eagle Warehouse was down the end of the block at the bottom of Columbia Heights, the street I was on, and they had a huge eagle just like this on the railroad. And I always tried to get that eagle later because they were closing the railroad, but I think it went to the Brooklyn Museum, which is probably where it belongs. Fancy cancels on railroad covers are very uncommon. I show you 2, and they're very few with railroad things in them, names. This is the Norwich and Western and Long Island Railroad. These are route agent markings used to cancel stamp. They're applied by the route agents. They're not fancy cancels per se. They're just fancy devices used by the route agents. Now, this slide is corrupted here, but you can see at the top here the designation that railroads in 1838 were shall be post roads. So this is the Act of Congress, July 7th, 1838, establishing that all railroads in the United States could be post roads if the Postmaster General could make a contract with the owners of the railroad. Of course, that was an if, and there are some railroads that wouldn't be reasonable terms, and so they didn't carry the mail. In the other slide here, we see that the mileage from 1837 was under 1,000 miles, and then up to 22,000 miles before the Civil War, and then in 1867, 34,000, and then it went 3 times more, over 100,000 miles by the 1880s, and it kept on going too. Of course, railroads are still very important for carrying freight and for carrying mail. I again emphasize, however, that most mail transported by railroads do not show railroad markings on them. It's only when the mail was given to a railroad route agent that you have a railroad marking on them. This is one of the messenger markings. You see CPRR in the lower left blue marking, MESSR, messenger. And this is a marking on a Civil War, on a Western paste-up cover. They took the front of 2 different envelopes because there were 2 letters inside, and they glued them to this big yellow envelope that carried the letter. But it was carried by a Central Pacific Railroad. That's the same railroad that built the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1867, they were building the Transcontinental Railroad, but they had other railroad routes in California, and this is an example of a route messenger marking on one of those. Later on in the 1870s, 80s, there were these directional markings used as killers by, same as the grids in the 1847, they had these killers, and they said N, E, S, and W for northeast, south, and west. And I show you 2 N's at the top. They're fancy negative markings. One is very fancy. And at the bottom is a W. That's an RPO, and the top is agent. I don't see any difference. I don't know of any evidence that the agent is different from the RPO. It's just whatever terminology was decided by that particular route agent. Now, there are a few markings, fancy cancels, that are what you'd call fancy cancels. I bought last week a negative star cancellation on a 3-cent 1869 stamp with a Iowa Railroad. The cover I'm showing you here, the Lawrence and Bradford, is in New Hampshire, and this uses an OK postmark. This particular cover is photographed in Tal's book. It's very uncommon to do that. This is a cover no one's ever seen before. It's Hudson River RPO, and it has the name of what I consider the route agent, Pierce, as canceling the stamp. This is from the Darwin Esmond Correspondence. When I was young, my father found in an antique store a box of old letters, and to make a long story short, we ended up with 50 crates of paper from an old garage in the highlands of Newburgh, New York. He was a lawyer, saved every scrap of paper from the Civil War in the 1920s. And we spent 2 years going through it all. And this is one of the covers that I saved from that correspondence. There was nothing really great there, but it was a lot of stuff. This is a special usage on railroad marking. This is special delivery in combination with a Missouri, Mexico, and Jefferson City route agent marking. And that's like later. Now, these route agent markings are used into the 20th century. So Tal lists those, and they're all in his book. So if you're interested in following the name of different markings, different railroads, and there are people that collect that, I want to recommend this catalog. This is the sale of the William Wire collection. This is the largest collection of railroad postal markings that I know of. It's from 1977, and it's a Daniel Kelleher auction at the time that Stanley Richmond owned it. Now, the next to the last topic we're getting into is official business of the railroads. And this is an example of official business. This is a letter on the letterhead of the Belvedere, Delaware, and Flemington Railroads in 1857. And you see it has a hand stamp on the cover, Railroad Service. I actually have covers that say RRS on them and their service. There are different hand stamps used. And then these are printed often. And there's some fancy corner cards with the name of the railroad on service. So there's a whole field of official railroad. I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. This is a very interesting fluky cover. The person sending it marked RRB in, there's over 50 examples of the hand stamp on the cover. Back of the cover is just like this, covered with all of these, and the stamp is over these markings. So he put these RRBs on it before he put the stamp on it, and then he got postmarked, and it goes to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But you will note at the bottom that this is marked railroad business, and so that was why the hand stamps were applied. It was just a cute thing to do, and it's not illegal to do this, but they don't play any official role here. However, the hand stamp was made to be used for railroad business on official mail. The Confederates had this railroad business too. This is a envelope made for the Mississippi Railroad with the RRB. I think the usage here is probably a personal usage because, of course, during the Confederacy, you used any kind of envelope you could get to send your letters. And so here we have one that is not sent on the tray itself. It's a personal letter, probably. The letter's not in it. Here's a cover that is a real official business cover from 1879. And you see the corner card here. You see a printed address for the route agent. You see what station name is to be filled in. We talk about which train it is on the left. Now, this is an envelope prepared to send information about the train business. And finally, I'll show you a hand stamp device here a little later, 1888. And this is not a station agent marking. It's a superintendent's office hand stamp, but it's like a station agent's marking for that train to Seabic, Maine from Bangor, and it goes to the station agent. So this is official business. Now, the last topic we're going to get into is the Transatlantic Railroad. And I would recommend this book. It's Stephen Ambrose, nothing like it in the world. Very interesting book to read. It has nothing to do with stamps. It's the story of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Lincoln was a very strong proponent for the Transcontinental Railroad. He talked about it before he signed the act in 1862. It wasn't until January of 1863 that the Central Pacific broke ground. So we have a cover here from February of 1864. This is a propaganda cover, and these covers started in 1859, and they are promoting the use of the overland mail by railroad. So this says per overland mail via Placerville and Salt Lake. Well, that's a route that was not used. This one began from Sacramento, the actual train. And then it says under that, but we must have the, and there's a little black pointed hand, and then it shows you, points to the picture of the railroad train. So this is, we must have the railroad. And the railroad was started. At this time, it wasn't much out of Sacramento. I don't think it was even 100 miles of railroad by February of 1864. Hutchins and Rosenfeld are famous printers of California letter sheets, and many of the nice letter sheets are printed by that company. This is the great Curry Knives print across the continent, and it shows you a train going off into the distance and it shows you on the left Indians and the trains and mountains, and then on the left the development of new towns. There's a public school they're emphasizing there. So this is the future of the trains bringing civilization to the West. This is a very desirable, very nice print. This is one of the large prints, and it was made in 1868. It's worth a lot more than most railroad covers. This is a reproduction of the great poster that was produced in Chicago at the opening of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was May 10th, 1869. And you can see in the lower part of this, it says Pullman's Palace sleeping cars. Of course, they were produced in Chicago. It says connections made at Cheyenne for Denver, Central City, and Santa Fe. I'll get to that at the last slide here, but there were no connections by train at that time. There was just stagecoaches going south to Denver. Then the very bottom, it has the name of the agents in Chicago for this. I was told there were only 2 copies of this poster known. I don't know if that's true or not. This is the earliest known cover that is continually by train from the west to the east. There are 2 covers dated May 10th at San Francisco, but those covers had to be carried by stagecoach between the 2 ends of the trains because the train hadn't been completed at that time by the time those covers got to Utah. So this one went all the way. Now, how do we know it went by train? Well, it's dated May 13th, and in New York it gets forwarded to France, and it's dated May 22nd. So that's 9 days from San Francisco to New York. The only way this letter could have gotten across the country is by train. And this is a cover going the other way. Here we have Danbury, Connecticut, May 11th. And it's docketed here. You can see May 11th is in the docket, and then May 21st is in the docket. And actually, he replied on May 21st. So we know that the letter was received by May 21st, and that's 10 days. So again, from east to west, this is the earliest known east to west cover. The last cover I'm showing you here is a propaganda cover. Like the other propaganda cover I showed you for with the picture of the train, but this one's from Denver, and I want to show you that postmark says Denver, Colorado, and that's an 1868 usage. In 1868, there were no trains from Denver, although this is showing you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different lines. Well, this is all fanciful. This is propaganda. The important route here is the northern one, the one that's marked Denver Pacific Railroad. The citizens of Denver in 1867 began to raise money and to build the railroad themselves to go up to Cheyenne, which is a station stop on the Union Pacific Railroad at the top of the map there. And it was the completion of that railroad in 1870 that opened up Denver, and the population of Denver went from under 5,000 to 35,000 by the end of 1870. So the railroad wasn't even open 6 months, and the city had jumped 7 times population. The other important route here is not the one that goes east, but the one under that. It says UPRRED. That's Union Pacific Railroad Eastern Division. That became later named as the Kansas Pacific Railroad. It goes to Kansas City, and that's the other Eastern Railroad that goes across Kansas, and it did hook up in Denver in 1870, a few months after the Denver Pacific opened. And that concludes my talk, I think. Thank you for listening, and I hope you got something useful out of this. I'll be happy to try to answer questions.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Milgram. Thank you for this really detailed. I think we can all agree those are one of the largest collection of railroad covers that I've seen. It's a really sort of an amazing, impressive presentation. First one, you mentioned you also study steamboat mail. When did the use of steamboats or ships for mail become commonplace?
Began from the very first. Mail was carried on the Hudson River by steamboats, and there were quite a few covers. The late Calvin Hahn wrote about them, and his collection came up at a Siegel auction, and I bought three of them from there, and there's some even better covers I didn't get. But the New Orleans in 1812 was the first steamboat to carry mail out of New Orleans, and their letters carried on the New Orleans. In fact, there's the first day cover known. It was in the Dewey Somnol collection sold at Sotheby by Andy Levitt in the 1970s. I forgot the date of the auction. That's the best steamboat auction about steamboat covers is the Dewey Somnol collection. It was added on to by other people, including Fisher Simmons. But steamboats carried mail from the start. Ships carried mail too. We've only been talking about inland waterways, but ocean waterways are steamships, and they carried mail. And we have a third group of mail, and that's coastal vessels. Nobody's ever really talked much and written much about the coastal vessels, but there was a lot of coastal mail carried back and forth. When Tim O'Connell was talking about carrying mail, it was carried by water from Charleston up to the east. Of course, he mentioned the North Carolina swamps, but the water is a good way of transporting both heavy goods as well as mail, and mail was carried on water.
Do you ever look at the correspondence inside the covers you have?
Well, that's the way you get interested in covers.
Yeah.
You read letters.
Sure.
Collect Civil War letters. Whoever answered that question, you collect Civil War letters, you'll stop collecting the covers. You'll just collect the letters because they're so interesting. No, you always read that. But I'll tell you, I have made a lot of major finds at postal history dealers that didn't bother to open up their letters. I remember once getting a illustrated campaign letter sheet for Henry Harrison that the guy hadn't opened it up and looked at it.
That leads to a question that I had. You showed the one cover that had a hand stamp on it, and then the letter inside had a hand stamp on it. You said that was that's a fairly rare item that doesn't happen too often?
That was the Military Railroad one.
Right.
Oh no, I also showed the case. Well, that was a particular person doing that. He had the hand stamp, and he put the hand stamp on his letter. That's very uncommon to do that.
How scarce are railroad covers, and is their value very expensive, or can you get sort of fairly common items as well?
It's a great area to collect because they're really cheap. You can get a RPO marking for as little as $1. You really can. There are all of these many markings that are not even worth $5. You can get hundreds under $5. Now, when you get into some of the ones I showed you, then you're into the hundreds of dollars for certain markings. The Baltimore Railroad on a stampless cover, that's $35, $50 cover. So that's an 1850 railroad route agent postmark. That's affordable.
Yeah, I think you did answer this in your talk, but I'll ask it anyway. Would route agent station markings be used on the train or in the railroad station?
They were used by the route agents, and the route agents had what I think were boxes of these hand stamps, and they had one with this name of this station, this name of this station, so it used that hand stamp at that particular station. The letter to be given had to be given to a route agent in order for him to put it into the mail. He's a mail employee. He's like a post office, a traveling post office. A route agent is. And you can look on a route agent as a traveling post office. He is. He's the same as any postmaster in the country, and he just happens to be stationed to be on a train. There were route agents on steamboats, and certain routes on steamboats had route agents. Many steamboats, however, did not have route agents, but did carry mail. That's another topic, and I think actually it's being discussed later talk. But route agents on the trains had nothing to do with station agents. I don't think the station agents would handle anything but the freight, or help the passenger get on the train and off the train, and give information. But that had nothing to do with the mail. The mail was always handled by post office employees, and the letters would have been given to the route agent, or maybe there was a box at a particular station that way letters were put in, and he'd open up the box and take them out and put them into his pouch and put them on the train. I don't, this is really not known in detail, but that would be my supposition. But the mail was handled only by route agents, and I think that's, that's the postal laws. Even today, a postal employee has to handle the mail, and once it's in the mail, only a post office employee can handle it.
Right. This is a question posed by a couple of our attendees, so I'll just sort of summarize. How financially important was the mail to railroads? Was carrying mail an important contributor to the revenue of any of these rail lines?
I don't really know that. I would say the answer to that is probably not very important, because all railroads carry freight, and all railroads today, well, many railroads at that time, there were many more people on railroads in the earlier time. Today, we have other means of transportation like airplanes. But in this period of time, the railroads picked up all the people passage between big city and big city. Everybody went by train. Why would you take a horse and wagon when you can go by train? It was much easier and much faster, usually. It didn't have the bouncing of a carriage. Carriages were still used in short distances, but little by little, before the age of cars, of course, we're talking now, with 50 years between these railroads and that time of cars, turn of the century. But railroads, but you're asking me about the money. I don't know of the comparative aspect of that. I would say they're important. I'll tell you where they were where mail was very important, and that was the San Francisco mail to New York on the steamship lines. That was a contract that was worth millions of dollars, and it was an important aspect of the transportation of mails. Was big money to the steamship companies that took the mail from San Francisco to Panama or Nicaragua, and then there was a second line of steamboats that took the mail from those two countries up to New York. But I would say, like the Union Pacific Railroad and transcontinental mail, I would say the mail aspect of it is not a big part of their money. The biggest part of the money for railroads across the country was that they were given land grants to the sides of the railroads, and they were able to sell all this land, so many miles on both sides of the track. And that was a very important consideration for them to build the railroads in the first place.
I think that's all the questions we have. A number of people have asked about the books that you mentioned during your talks.
I mentioned the Ambrose, Stephen Ambrose, Nothing in the World, Spreading the News by John, Remley, the railroad book, the Station and Route Agent Markings by Towle. There is a similar book by the Mobile Post Office for the steamboat route agents. It's a thinner book, and there is some overlap between the Towle book and the McDonald book, which is the other book. So there's a second book I didn't discuss about steamboat route agents. It looks just like the Towle book, has drawings in it, and it gives text and rarity markings too.
You also mentioned
you must get Feldman's book. It weighs a ton, but it's a valuable reference, and that's what it is. It's not a book you sit to browse, but it's a book you use. And I guarantee if you collect this stuff, you'll use that book.
You also mentioned a Kelleher auction.
Oh, that's just a particular auction. There are other auctions. That's the biggest auction. Yeah, that was the illustrations are are separate in that. It's an auction catalog, see?
Right.
You know, with page after page of, you know, black and white auction catalog. In 1977, there was only black and white. So that's what this shows you. Here's two nice 1847 covers. I bet Gordon would like to have either of those. But these are covers sold at an auction. And it has the prices realized in it too. And so it's a valuable reference for rarity. You see, you use auction catalogs, I find personally, are a great reference for all sorts of things. They're a great reference for pictures. There's information in the catalogs, and there is prices, so it gives you an idea of rarity, comparative rarity. So I find auction catalogs are very valuable reference.
As a librarian here at the APRL, I would agree with that. I think with that question, we'll conclude this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium. For all those joining us for this session, we want to thank you for your attendance and ask that you join us on behalf of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the National Postal Museum, and the United States Philatelic Classic Society in thanking Dr. Milgram for this presentation this morning.